Welcome back to Sociology 226. This is W.E.B. Du Bois, Video 1. In this video, I have 3 tasks. In the first, I'll tell you about the life of W.E.B. Du Bois. Next, I want to look to the historical period in which he was writing through an historical sociology of race. Finally, I'll get you ready to do the readings. A note, however, on pronunciation. I will use Du Bois rather than DuBois for the principal reason that Du Bois left us instructions on how to pronounce his name. Du Bois. Let's get started. Alongside Karl Marx, I think Du Bois's life might be one of the most fascinating in the sociological canon, or lives that should be included in the sociological canon. He is too often overlooked in light of Marx, Durkheim, and Weber in isolation. We'll look at the historical period in which he lived in greater detail in a minute, but it is worth noting some important attributes about Du Bois before we explore this period and his literary contributions. Du Bois is born in New England. This is going to come up again and again, because the way that life was in small-town New England in 1868 and the life in a small town in the southern United States was extremely different. Du Bois is born and raised as a New Englander and maintains the cultural dispositions of an educated man of the North. He wants to study at the greatest university in New England at the time, Harvard. He would later compare his early New England life with what he would encounter throughout his education. Race and racial politics shifted as one traveled further south. The young Du Bois had his heart set on going to Harvard. However, it was expensive, then and now, to go there, and Du Bois did not have the cash. He attends Fisk University, an historically black college in Nashville, Tennessee, instead. He knew he was going to Harvard, he writes, just not yet. At Harvard, he attends lectures by famous American philosophers William James and Santayana. James' philosophy of pragmatism deeply influenced Du Bois, in spirit if not letter, because he wants to apply the knowledge he gained in the university to practical problems. Du Bois is the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard, though again, not in sociology. He employs exactly the same methods we found in Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. Du Bois teaches for 15 years. He does so for 2 years at Wilberforce, an historically black college, at the University of Pennsylvania, for $600 a year he tells us, and spends 13 years at Atlanta University. There he does some extremely innovative work on race relations in Georgia, on the education of black people and on the education as a whole, and in urban sociology. We'll talk about these methods and studies in the next video. Du Bois is one of the first American public intellectuals. What does that mean? It means that not only is he interested in doing sociological studies of race, he is interested in applying them in the real world. He is a founding member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and wrote an incredible amount of literature. In this video, I'll introduce you to his most read work, The Souls of Black Folk. You'll read some of his later stuff after this video. Let's look to the historical period in which Du Bois was writing. We can look to the historical context in which Du Bois was writing to see the importance of his work and how his thought changed throughout time. I'm not going to give you a full outline of 100 years of American history here. But what I want to do is show you, in general detail, what was going on throughout Du Bois's work, and show the historical tensions that his academic and public work was addressing as he lived. Du Bois was always quick to link his work to the historical period, so we can read this 100 years, 1860 to 1960, as a timeline of his life and thought before delving into his particular viewpoints. Here I want to read this timeline as a timeline of race, just as Du Bois called his autobiography an autobiography of race. I can't dwell on every item for the time it deserves, but I can point out to you why they matter for Du Bois. Of crucial importance here is the end of the American Civil War in 1865. The American Civil War ends 1865, and Lincoln, the Republican great emancipator, dies the same year. The outcome of the Civil War, obviously, left a huge rift in American society, and the question of what do we do with all these freed people, left free from the shackles of slavery, was a hotly debated question. From Marx and Durkheim, we know that freedom isn't simply a concept. There are material prerequisites to be free in our capitalist society. One needs to have work, one must pay rent, one must feed their children, and so on and so forth. The chief question facing people in this post-Civil War US was how to reintegrate the entire country, while simultaneously attending to this problem. In 1860, there were almost 5 million slaves in the southern United States, now free and subject to the whims of work, debt, success, landowning, and so on and so forth.
What's the best method to achieve national harmony and racial harmony? How do we account for successes? What about racism, exclusion, oppression? How do we educate people? These are crucial questions facing Du Bois and the collective consciousness of the United States. When we think of Marx's material conditions, then, don't just think about the components of the individual workplaces where we do our jobs. It's not just about paychecks, Starbucks aprons, and espresso machines. Here we need to think about our overall existence in and around labor and production. The change from the material conditions of the estate to the conditions of the free farmer and industrial labor, that's the point. So while the 13th Amendment ended slavery, and the 14th guaranteed citizenship to all people born in the United States, how people lived, dwell, express, and engage those rights in real life is the place where Du Bois did his sociology.
Obviously, the dream of a harmonious and racially integrated United States was not realized.
Though Du Bois lived from 1878 to 1963, he would not see true legal integration, save true actual integration, within his long life. Jim Crow refers, so far as I could find out, to a racist cartoon character that was used as a descriptor for black Americans. Jim Crow laws refer to those laws that were adopted to maintain racial segregation in the United States until the Civil Rights era. The legally established doctrine of separate but equal was used to justify the exclusion from the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. That is, both white and black Americans had the same rights, they just could not exercise them together. So separate but equal parts of the bus, separate but equal water fountains, and separate but equal schools. This was the legal precedent on which the Jim Crow laws were realized. Schools are very important, as Du Bois was a champion of black education, and not just education as a single thing, but university education. How can we realize our human equality when education conditions are so strongly and sharply divided? Which forms of education will bring about equality? And how can one be educated in a hostile, racist world? These are crucial questions. Segregation was, and still is, a key problem here, either in terms of separate buildings, separate castes that divide students, their parents, and their material conditions. This is a Karl Marx kind of question.
Then there's the issue of American foreign policy.
With all the racial strife inside the United States, the Spanish-American War is one of the darkest moments in American foreign policy, and that's saying something. With the war between the US and Spain, the US starts to acquire its own colonies. Think Cuba, especially Guantanamo Bay, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, that remain in the US orbit to this day. The US, of course, thought itself to be the beacon of freedom, away from taxation without representation of the British Crown, but now we see it acquiring its own colonies. So not only does Du Bois note a racial problem in the United States, but there is a racial dimension to American foreign policy. Colonialism is not just a European problem. The US is playing the same game too. This deeply shapes Du Bois's politics, and our little historical sociology here. While the US was intent on staying out of European conflicts before the Great War, they entered that one in 1917. This, the same year that the Russians left the First World War after the October Revolution. This has a twofold significance for our little historical sociology of race. First, the US returns to the world stage as an arbiter of who gets what, especially as part of the Versailles Conference. Secondly, Communist Russia is born. It enacts, under Lenin, a massive project to industrialize the country. Before the world knew for certain what Stalin was doing, or cared to know in some cases, many saw this massive egalitarian project as a beacon of success for raising the conditions of existence for the masses, including many in the black community. Moscow was also paying people to come study there, and Du Bois made a visit in 1926 that would mark his political shift throughout his career. Du Bois, and many others, saw Russia, and later China, as signs of progress that the US and its black citizens might follow. This, I should remind you, was before the Second World War, and before the stories of the gulags came to Western ears. Du Bois's personal politics, shaped by Cold War politics, are crucial to understanding his work.
Next we come to the Depression, the Second World War, and the Cold War.
The stock market crash was very important for Du Bois and many members of the American left, because not only did it show the problems of unabated capitalism and the racialized nature of the poverty that resulted throughout the affected countries, But Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was a government intervention into the economy that is credited with ending the Depression. The role of government intervention to address the failures of capitalism is of crucial importance here. I'm not going to describe to you the events of the Second World War. But after the Second World War, there was a new world order. Just as soon as Hitler is defeated, Churchill makes his famous Iron Curtain speech about how the specter of communism is the next threat. Like we needed to have another war after that one. Russia is not a newly emerging world power. The Soviet Union is the new red menace. With the Cold War going on, it also meant that leftist academics like Du Bois were suspected of being Soviet sympathizers or worse. The period marked the surveillance of Du Bois by the FBI. You can read the files online, and his 1951 arrest and acquittal for working as a foreign agent.
Finally, in Du Bois we find a politics of hope.
That hope came in Ghanaian independence. The transfer of power in what was once called the Gold Coast was a huge moment in African history. Nkrumah's self-governing African state was a beacon of hope for people like Du Bois. Think about it. The guy who was born 3 years after slavery ended, who saw Europe and Americans divide the world up into their own colonies and govern them brutally, saw a state leave one of those empires. Ghana was a beacon of hope for the left, showing that collective organization wasn't just leading to abstract solidarity or longer lunch breaks at work. It made a real difference in the world. Education was an essential part of this story. So Du Bois ends up traveling to and staying in Nkrumah's Ghana. He renounced his American citizenship and dies in Ghana in 1963.
Let's look and see how this historical context shaped Du Bois's work.
Throughout Du Bois's writing, he often talks about the veil over the country, referring to the racism and racial structure which dominated the United States. As I pointed out to you, Du Bois was born in New England. In his autobiographical writing, he shows that the racial structures in the North were very different than the racial structures in the South. His high school principal actually encouraged him to take university prerequisites and set his sights on pursuing higher education. Earlier, I spoke about Du Bois's New England upbringing and the differences in the postbellum South, that is, the South after the Civil War. In the Jim Crow South, racial structures are totally different than his tiny New England town. Remember, the separate but equal doctrine is a caste system. This is equally important for him and his understanding of racial development because being black in New England and being black in Tennessee in 1888 are two extremely different things. Not only this, but the schooling is extremely different as well. Historically, black colleges have incredibly low graduation rates, and today the students hold an extremely high amount of debt. The graduation rate at Fisk now is around 30%. At Queens, it is 89%. This dual experience is crucial for Du Bois. Having white schools and black schools as separate but equal does not work. The structures of race are perpetuated even in the educational system. From this, we take that A, race is not biological, but shaped in institutional structures, and B, that a chief problem to achieving actual racial equality is actual equal education. This problem of education shapes the entirety of Du Bois's career. While Du Bois is studying at Harvard, he gets a large enough scholarship that he doesn't have to work in the summer, and spends his time as a school teacher in rural Tennessee. Here again we see the specter of race haunting him, but also the poverty of the South. Race is not related to biology, again, but to the social and institutional structures through which we live our lives. Du Bois calls his autobiography an autobiography of race because it is these experiences that would shape his thought, and the application of that thought to racially underpinned educational structures would be his life's work.
I'll end this video telling you a bit about the souls of black folk.
Du Bois's most famous work is The Souls of Black Folk. It is incredibly beautiful, written in moving prose, and each chapter is introduced with a bar of the traditional songs expressing the souls of Black America. In The Souls, Du Bois is passionate about the race problem. Souls represents what we will call Du Bois's early liberal period. We call it this because Du Bois believes that with proper education, and despite the racism that is perpetuated in America and America's education system, the right educational structures will yield the best and brightest leaders who will be able to guide the rest of Black America into the promised land. In Souls, Du Bois is not an apologist for the state of the country. He doesn't think it is okay, but his model is of elite leaders emerging through educational structures. The more egalitarian this education is, the better. He addresses other topics facing the lot of black Americans, the problem of securing credit, working conditions they are subject to after the transition from slavery, and the social ills of segregation in America. All of these factors become manifest in what Du Bois sees as the main problem of the 20th century: race. The reading you'll do this week shows a very different understanding of race and a very different politics than those found in the Souls. Du Bois makes a solid transition further to the left, from the optimistic liberalism of Max Weber to the extremely critical work of Karl Marx. Herein lie buried many things if we read with patience may show the strange meanings of being black here in the dawn of the 20th century. This meaning is not without interest to you, gentle reader, for the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I can't emphasize how important it is to read this in context. At exactly the same time that Durkheim was writing Suicide, Du Bois was doing the sociology of race. If we include Du Bois as a classic sociological thinker, then the sociology of race is as old and foundational as the suicidology that Durkheim was doing. It isn't the classical sociology of race, it is just plain sociology.
Okay, it's your turn. When you're going through the readings this week, I want you to think about the difference between the writing style in what I assigned and what I just told you about in the Souls of Black Folk.